Now, you started by saying that at page 5, if you look at paragraph 14, you started by saying that this phenomenon of using digital technology to deliberately spread falsehoods online is real and pervasive. And I suppose if you look at that together with your opening paragraphs at page 2, do you have a copy of the report with you?
Yes, I do.
Yes.
I do.
Where you're talking about what can multiracial, multi-religious societies like Singapore do to cope with massive deliberate falsehoods, how do societies fortify themselves, and so on. You would know that much of the attack is centered on religious, racial, and other social fault lines. Agree?
Agree, yes.
And when you then speak of these spread of falsehoods online as being real and pervasive, it's really targeted at these fault lines, correct?
I mean, certainly if someone has a malicious intent, they would certainly want to hit at our vulnerable points. And certainly race and religion, language issues could potentially be fertile terrain.
Right. And these attacks can be significant false news, one-off, which generates, as we've seen from some of the news stories that we've put to some of our representatives, incites violence, incites hatred, and sometimes results in actual physical violence, which leads to loss of property, loss of life, destruction, and so on. That's one kind of falsehood. The other kind can equally be the slow drip effect of misinformation, having slow effect of undermining key institutions, trust by people in the government, trust by people in key institutions that hold up the country. Would you agree with this definition?
Yes, I mean, there are different approaches. Certainly, someone who is out to with ill intent, could resort to a variety of means. So some could take the long-term approach, and others could, taking advantage of a certain event, be it elections or a certain crisis in the country, they will certainly want to drive a wedge. I mean, these provide very opportunistic occasions, for political entrepreneurs, to take advantage of.
Yes. What I mean, just to be clear, what I mean is you have, on the one hand, one type of falsehood, which is, for example, saying that President Obama is Muslim. That's one kind of falsehood. And then thereafter followed by subsequent postings along these lines. Or you have those which suggest that Muslims are celebrating terrorist attacks and then proliferating that online to incite hatred for Muslims. You have one kind of event like this. On the other hand, you have a spectrum where you have the slow drip effect of slowly undermining key institutions and government and social cohesion with false information, which may be misleading in some ways and truth in others, and then thereafter slowly feed this into the system. Both types would be characterized as online falsehoods. Would you agree?
Yes, I would.
Yes. And the use of, you go on to say that the use of technology of choice, which has its ease, speed, and difficulty of tracing, would exacerbate that problem. Would you agree?
I would agree.
And we've also heard some representatives tell us that it's also easily manipulated through automated bots, troll farms, and the like. Would you accept?
Yes, I mean, from my understanding of technology, there are many ways in which the impact could be amplified.
And so one of the recommendations you propose in the first section of your report under A is when you look at the whole spectrum of potential online falsehoods, from the one significant event that I mentioned to the slow drip pernicious ones, you recommend public education principally, and that can be found at A1. And you also talk about supporting indigenous research to better understand the multifaceted nature of the falsehood phenomenon and so on. Would you elaborate on this briefly?
Yes, I'll be happy to, Mr. Tong.
Yes. Focusing on how you think this public education can be constructed, particularly from your perspective as someone who sees students regularly and who interacts with that generation of the population. How do you think that can be best attenuated?
I think certainly when we look at education, I think it needs to be fairly pervasive in the sense that I think it should take place throughout all the different educational levels, and certainly one, at the societal level. I think the challenge really here is, do people have the ability, to ask the right questions, to make the required value judgments, to decide whether something could be relied or not. And so, the students, in the institutions of higher learning, they are very much the digital natives. I wouldn't even call myself a digital migrant. I don't think I've migrated completely. I'm not even on any of these social media platforms. But for them, these social media platforms are a very important source of community, but also a very important source of news. Whether, putting aside whether it's true or not, information, news, gossip, entertainment, these are very important sources of information for them. So in that sense, it is also being part of a community. The idea that I'm in this space. So I think education will have to be very subtle because we don't want young Singaporeans to say, well, this is another national education. National education has become a meme. If you ask the young people today, it's a meme for government propaganda and all. But here we're dealing with very serious matters, right? How do we discern, what is reliable and what is not? At the same time, without telling them, right, leaving them to make the judgment, right, whether they want to believe or not to believe, or to ask further questions or to seek corroboration. So it's these sort of skill sets that I think are very important.
Yes.
For our society, and I'm not in that area of education, but I believe that you need different sort of skill sets, at different levels, to enable them, to be sensitized, on the one hand, not to believe everything that they read, but also not to disbelieve everything that they read, because I think in this age of falsehoods, it is possible that people may just decide to switch off and say, well, I'm not going to believe anything that I read, and I think that would be very harmful as well.
And become too cynical.
Yes, right. So I think we need that healthy skepticism. And of course, getting there is always the challenge.
Well, finding the right balance is also the challenge, isn't it?
Oh, definitely.
And also we heard, I think you were in the room earlier when Dan Shepard said that actually a lot of people go on social media to get the news, as you've just said, but the news they get will be different from person to person because of the filter bubbles and echo chambers. And that also shapes the kind of content that each of the persons that represent and make up society would be exposed to.
Oh, definitely. I think we are now in an age where there are multiple realities in the sense of each person. Right, so the reality that I see is very different from the reality that Mr. Tong, that you might see, and so this is where it becomes important. Right? If we talk about public education, not just to equip them with these skill sets, to sensitize them, but also to enable them to have that openness of mind. I know these are very fairly highfalutin ideas and ideals, but I think this is really what we need to try to strive towards, because I don't think the government is in a position to tell each person what is it that they should believe or not believe. And I think the moment any government does that, then it's more likely than not that those pieces of information will not be believed at all. So it's this challenge that we have, and it means being able to sensitize. I use the word sensitize a lot because we don't want a hard sell, but at the same time, these are very vital skill sets for any person living in a democracy, because we are going to make important choices, whether they relate to state or even personal choices, based on the sort of information that we have. And given that there could be this multiple realities, I think it's something that we have to spend a lot of effort, and I certainly hope that, and that's why I mentioned in my recommendation that significant resources be devoted to this endeavor.
By multiple realities, what you mean is that we are exposed to different types of news feeds.
Yes.
Not that we are all living in different dimensions of reality.
Yeah,
Right?
the
So
former.
it shapes your outlook of what news is. It shapes your outlook of what opinion pieces might be out there. There
Yes.
are different ones that we are exposed to, and that's really what you mean.
Yes, I mean the sort of news that I seek, would be very different from the sort of news that my teenage son would seek. So we might be living in the same place. We are living in the same place. But our perceptions of reality might differ to some extent.
I understand. Would you also agree that education, and I think what you've just described is useful, coupled with, I suppose you would also agree, media literacy, a higher degree of upscaling knowledge so that there's a greater sense of discernment. These are useful, but really more long-term in nature. Would you agree?
They are, but the long term starts today.
Of course.
I mean, we have to make that effort.
So on my spectrum of falsehoods that one sees online, which we started this session with, it will be useful to protect or inoculate ourselves against the drip feed kind of slow misinformation with bits of information that is true and bits that are not true. Having a more discerning public, one who's more educated, more able to, as you say, be sensitized to what might be obviously untrue and also have some sense of discernment, that's very useful. But would you agree that where there is a obvious one-off at the other end of the spectrum kind of false information designed to be very targeted, to incite very emotive feelings, you can't go and rely on media literacy at that point in time and public education. At that point in time, you either have it or you don't. And if you don't have it, then I think some steps need to be taken beyond just education. Would you agree?
I would agree. I think what Mr. Tong you're referring to is in the face of clear and present danger.
Yes.
Yes. Then I think within our legislative arsenal, we would want to certainly have the tool to be able to deal with this sort of situation, which is in contrast to the slow burn. Although I would also argue that perhaps sometimes even what I call the slow burn effect of falsehoods may actually have a greater impact because the slow burn effect is a lot more insidious.
Yes.
It could operate within us in our societies without us even knowing it.
Well, some witnesses like Dr. Shashi Jayakumar has come and said, it's likely that it's already started, that we can't assume that it's not been done on us in Singapore, and it's also not to be taken for granted that this kind of slow burn, pernicious effects the seeds of that has not yet already been planted. And I think it's not something you would disagree with, right?
I haven't had a chance to look at Dr. Jayakumar's submission. So
Sure.
I don't know what's the evidence that he based his findings on. I'm sure that he has a basis for saying that. But I think we should treat this as something which shouldn't surprise us. And my concern is that we shouldn't be alarmist about it. I mean, there are always these threats, and we shouldn't get we shouldn't get unduly worried. We should certainly continue to maintain our sense of readiness. But yes, I think I would not disagree. That it could be possible. That the seeds of some of these slow burn effect could have been planted.
Right. And I think what you said earlier is that this slow burn, drip misinformation could be as adverse, if not more so, than those at the other end of the spectrum. I think that's what I thought I heard you say earlier.
Yes, yes. I think the slow burn effect is a lot more difficult to manage. But someone who is determined and has the resources, that would certainly work very well, because the tools that we have, within our legislation, we can deal with clear and present danger relatively well, but trying to deal with the sort of fractures and fissures that may become bigger over time, that may take a lot harder. I mean, it's your proverbial frog in a boiling saucepan.
Okay, can you go to page 7 of your submission?
Yeah, but Mr. Before, if I could just interrupt, because you mentioned about talking about my recommendation about research. I think what
paragraph A2, is it?
Yes, A2,
okay,
yes, on page 5.
Yes.
I mean, I've been trying to follow the media reports on the select committee hearings, and certainly we hear of many foreign examples of falsehoods, being perpetrated. But I think we need to better understand the ecosystem in Singapore. What is it that might make Singapore and Singaporeans more susceptible to falsehoods? Because I think despite the various incidents that have been cited, that involve local cases, we have not been badly affected. And I think that does point to something that speaks about at some level of the internal resilience. But I think we need to know more. My concern is that the committee might then perhaps make recommendations that draws a lot from foreign examples. Yes, the comparators are useful, but we must be careful that the cure is not worse than the disease.
Of course,
yeah.
Of course. I agree with you that, some of the examples that have been cited of experiences overseas, yes, have not happened in Singapore, but I think you would also agree that we don't want to be waiting till something as adverse as that has happened before we do something about it.
Certainly, right. And that's why I think we need to understand, falsehoods. What is it that might make falsehoods gain a lot more traction in Singapore?
Take for example, if you've been following what's been debated at these sessions, take for example, falsehood which suggests that there are racial disagreements, or news in, I don't know whether we can put it up, but news of a Muslim man allegedly raping a Buddhist woman in Myanmar, which then resulted in street riots within 24 hours. I think 1 or 2 persons were killed, a mosque was damaged, and businesses were destroyed. Now, that, of course, is in a different country, and I appreciate a different social context as well. But if something as racially inflammatory seeks to draw on the divides or accentuate and split open those divides were to happen, we don't want to be waiting for that to occur before we decide that we have to do something about it.
Oh, definitely. I'm familiar with Myanmar. I do, as a volunteer faculty, teach on religion and rule of law programs in Myanmar, and I've been to Buddhist monasteries where they have very explicit pictures of Buddhists allegedly being killed by Muslims, and these right in a Buddhist monastery. So I am very familiar with that, and so I have no disagreement, with the fact that we need to be prepared. But my point is, I think we know in my view, relatively little, and I think we need to know more. What is it that has made Singapore less vulnerable thus far? Because if we know what is it that works for us, we want to ensure that the foundations of those are continue to be maintained as well as enhanced,
and that we continue to focus on what has been right for us.
Correct, and yes, and not be excessively concerned about what's going to happen. Yes, we must be concerned. I think in the end, it's really about getting the balance right.
Yes.
And I feel that if the committee would be able to support the view that we need to have further research on the ecosystem in Singapore, I think that would certainly help us deal with the problem of deliberate falsehood. Because we must also remember, deliberate falsehood is a constantly evolving phenomenon.
You're right. What you're really saying is, at the end of the day, in deciding how to propose the set of countermeasures, be it education, literacy, legislation, one has to appreciate the landscape that we operate in. We have to bear in mind that what has worked for us has served us well. And I think what you are suggesting is that we don't go and throw out the baby with the bathwater in coming up with measures which disregard what has made Singapore safe and sound over so many years.
Yes, and here I would like to take the opportunity to talk about, to refer to the trust, that we have in our institutions of state, in the media generally. And so, it is important that even as we seek to prepare ourselves, for any untoward events, we do not ignore what is it that has worked for us, but instead constantly ensure, that those pillars will remain to be strong.
Okay, I understand. Yeah. I was going to refer you to page 7 and paragraph 15. Yeah, and I think that's, you say you are largely in agreement with this aspect of the Green Paper, and you say that the motivations and reasons for spreading deliberate falsehoods can be collapsed into two broad categories. And you said, one, as a tool of subtle and strategic warfare by states and their agents, pivoting on disinformation to achieve certain political, economic, and strategic objectives. And two, for individuals and commercial entities, it is primarily about profit-making. Just briefly elaborate on these two aspects.
Yes. So here we are looking at, I make this assertion, this submission, based on what I've read, what I've studied, and certainly, we are looking at deliberate falsehoods, particularly online falsehoods, as a form of warfare, and of course, to be more specific, asymmetric warfare.
Yes.
Right. So the idea that it doesn't matter that two countries are not equally resourced, but the idea that a country that may not have as strong a military or may not be so technologically advanced, may be able to use deliberate or disinformation to pursue strategic objectives, and I think that has been adequately documented, and this is important for us because we do have several vulnerable points, those that relate to our multiracial, multi-religious, multilingual society. But I also want to emphasize that even as we are mindful that there are these vulnerabilities, we do not exaggerate them. That if we look at how far we have come, it also does point to the fact that we should instead, look at how these diversity could work for us. When we talk about, when I talk about individuals and commercial entities, I think very often this is really about making money in the end, or pursuing other objectives that they may have, whether political or otherwise. And I think so long as we are clear that the motivations can be broadly put into these two groups, I think that can help us come up with better measures, to handle them.
Yeah, I think you sort of anticipated where I was coming from, because in constructing the right measures, I think one really has to understand what the likely motivations are in the first place.
Yes.
Right. Now, you make the point, I think, what comes through from your paper is that you're looking at the possible measures, and if I can frame your thoughts in this way, you take the view that there really has to be a range of different measures, differentiated for the different type of falsehoods that may be pervaded online, whether it's the, as I said, the one large falsehood that has a significant effect, or the slow drip misinformation, but differentiated remedies for differentiated types of ill or mischief that we might see. That's the first point I think you make here. The second is that there is also a need for a range of different options, including things like we discussed earlier, public education, further research, media literacy. Third, you take the point, and I think, in my view, quite rightly, that any response has to be taken in the context of our local climate, our local context, what has worked for us, and not to ignore that. And fourth, I think you say here that in any measure that is being proposed, one has to balance the interests between public discourse, proper public discourse, and the potential harm of the online falsehood that society might face from it. Have I summarized your broad approach accurately?
Yes, I think you've done very well.
Now, on this broad approach, and in seeking to strike the balance, you would agree that in terms of trying to deal with the mischief that this issue presents to us, there will be a range of options, including legislation. You talked about omnibus legislation here. Can you tell us what you mean by omnibus legislation?
Right. In my submission, when I refer to an omnibus legislation, I was referring to an all-encompassing legislation. That anything to do with deliberate online falsehoods, this would be the one piece of law.
Consolidated into one piece.
Yes, that we would go to.
Right.
And so that may mean, for example, pulling out, from other legislation, things that may deal with falsehoods, and bringing them all into this one omnibus legislation.
So but you wouldn't disagree with, and I'm not sure if you read the news on what Professor Goh Yihan has said, that on the current legislation, he feels that there are gaps in there in terms of dealing with the different types of online falsehoods. And he did a study, or he did a report which looks at 3 or 4 different real-life events and applying Singapore laws to it, and came up with the view that current legislation falls short. You don't disagree with that, would you?
I wouldn't disagree with my boss. No, but yeah, no. I mean, I'm not being facetious, but yes, I wouldn't disagree with him. But I think we should also bear in mind that where there are inadequacies, I think we can sharpen.
Yes.
I don't think the solution is that let's have a new legislation.
Okay. So your point in trying to understand what you say here about omnibus, your point about the omnibus that you make here, that we don't need a new one, is not the same thing as saying that we don't need some new legislation to deal with the problem that we have.
Yes, I mean, if we look at social media platforms, right, they are probably been around for 14, 15 years. So many of our legislation would predate that. And so I think that there will obviously be the need to update, the legislation, tweak them, sharpen them, refine them. But I would be cautious about, wanting to go for, a very all-encompassing legislation.
I understand. And the point I think you made, if you just look at your submission at D3 and D4, is that in constructing this legislation, one must seek to strike the balance. I mean, largely those 4 points I mentioned to you earlier. But what you say here is to ensure that there is no curtailment of public discourse in constructing such legislation. Correct?
Yes.
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 And you go on to say at D3 that the right to freedom of speech in turn entails the concomitant duty of responsible speech. And I think, speaking personally, I think that must be true, because there is no room for falsehoods, and the suggestion that you can say what you want includes falsehoods so that you can have free speech and proper public discourse. I wouldn't agree with that proposition. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't think we can ever run away from the fact that there will be falsehoods.
No, but the point is that because you want freedom of speech, that must include the ability to spread and start falsehoods.
Oh yeah, I don't think that there is this particular right. Yeah.
So that's what you mean by the concomitant duty of responsible speech as well.
Yes, I think in the end, even as we talk about freedom of speech, I think we should bear in mind that speech also has to be responsible.
Yes, and in fact, there are some restrictions. You got to ensure that you don't say anything that is racially or religiously divisive, seditious, and so on. Would you accept?
Yes, I mean, this is part of our landscape.
Yes. And so
our way
that's
of
the
life.
landscape in which free public discourse is to occur. And any legislative attempt to try to deal with this problem ought to take that into account.
Yes. I put a fair amount of emphasis on, that any legal regime, that this committee might recommend must continue to promote robust public discourse, because ultimately it is people who defeat deliberate falsehoods, right? Governments are very much the tool and agent, right? They will not be able to defeat the falsehoods. And so if we have a population, that is discerning, that is able to unpick, falsehoods and to be able to engage in that robust debate, I think that makes for a much healthier society, a society that would be able to deal with deliberate online falsehoods, without having to resort to very extreme measures.
Yes, I think, speaking for myself, I don't disagree with that. But I think it's also useful to keep in mind that whilst as you say here, there is a concomitant duty to do so as you embark on free public discourse, I think there must also be a need to ensure that there's the right balance. And one has to have a range of options in terms of remedies available to strike that right balance. Would you agree?
Yes, I don't disagree. I think it is important and to have a range, and that's why I use the term legislative arsenal. And this has been an attribute of the way we have drafted our legislation. So if you think about trying to deal with racial and religious disharmony,
yes.
Right, we have the whole range, right, from the Societies Act to the Penal Code to the Sedition Act, and if you really want to take out the big stick, you have the Internal Security Act. And I think looking at deliberate online falsehoods, I think that should also be the way to go. And that was why I have reservations about a very all-encompassing and omnibus type legislation. I think I think we need a range of calibrated measures, to cater to different sort of threats. And I think we are well served by what we have. Yes, we may need to plug the gaps, and I think if new legislation is needed, in my submission, I have acknowledged that that may have to be the road that we take. But I also mentioned about our anti-terrorism laws, right? You won't find our laws that deal with terrorism in one piece of legislation, and I think that there's a reason for that, right? Because there are different ways of dealing with the problem as it presents as it's presented to us, and I think if we continue with having that calibrated range, the differentiated measures, I think it will serve us well, because we don't want to take out a sledgehammer when, say, a nutcracker would be adequate to do the job.
Yeah, I think I understand. I mean, that analogy is I think, put in your paper as well. The point really is, I think we are dealing with what is the issue in this select committee hearing, and then also what do we need to do, and I guess finally how that is implemented. And I think what you've just been advocating goes to the how that can be done. And what you've been saying is that, yes, while there's a need to calibrate, have a calibrated response by way of new legislation, you would be slow to suggest that all fits into a new omnibus piece of legislation. But as we clarified earlier, that's not the same thing as saying that the current legislation doesn't have gaps which need to be filled.
Yes, I think if we talk about gaps, we could. I mean, my dean spoke about maybe the need for takedown orders for the previous witness before me spoke about.
He's given a range of options.
Tagging and all. Yes, so I think the provisions that we have certainly may be inadequate, and I wouldn't be surprised that if they are, to deal with this phenomenon of online falsehoods. Yes, so even though I do have reservations about an omnibus legislation, I do recognize the need, if the gaps are shown, for new legislation to fill that gap. But I think we should look at how our existing legislation, can be amended, to cope, to manage, with the evolving threat.
All right. Thank you, Prof. Tan. That's been very helpful.